Hello there, and welcome to Delightful Dissent. This is now episode 5, and today I'm going to be talking to Margaret Barrie. So welcome, Margaret. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Matthew. It's lovely to be here and sharing this platform.
Super, thank you. So in case you're new to Delightful Dissent, I want to give you a quick overview of really what it is and what we're doing. So I started this series because I'm really interested in those kind of deep assumptions, that the things that we don't think about that kind of hold us back and that can be a problem. And I want to share as much work as possible from people who are doing this assumption challenging work and get them out there, get those ideas out there to as many people as possible. But the other side of this is that I really want to build this assumption challenging practice into something that everyone can do, and to really give you a strong sense of what it is to do this work and how you might do it in a space that matters most to you. So it's really those two things. Yes, you can get useful tips and it might well be entirely relevant to whatever it is that you do, but equally I really want you to be able to figure out what this is for yourself, and so you can do it yourself. And the reason that it's called Delightful Dissent is because this is about challenging the way things are. And so challenging the way that people think and challenging the official message. But it's about doing so in a way that ultimately is positive and delightful and creates positive change, rather than being entirely negative and entirely critical. Because for me, that's personally a more joyful way to work, but equally it's ultimately a more successful way to work. It's what really changes things in the long run. So this is genuinely live, and it can be quite challenging. We are challenging assumptions, so we may explore difficult topics and we may use strong language, so it's possible that things might be challenging for you. So just be aware of that as you watch this, and if that's not something you're okay with right now, then please tune in another time. Finally, this is about engaging, and we do want you to engage, and we want you to ask us questions and challenge us as well. So please do share comments. And if you do share comments, we'll see them live, and there'll be a chance for us to talk about them as we go, and there'll be a chance for us, we'll actually explore them at towards the end of the hour, if there's some interesting stuff there for you and for us, so we can have that. Because this is, whilst it is primarily a conversation between Margaret and myself, it is also a conversation between you, and there's a much broader community and a much broader conversation going on. So please do engage as much as possible. And equally, if you're watching this on a recording, then please do comment, and we'll make sure that those comments get answered and engaged with too. So all is not lost if you're watching the recording either. So my guest today is Margaret Barrie, and we first met a couple of years ago now through the community I was running, and I was really interested in kind of Margaret's approach and what she's been doing. And in many ways, she's lived this kind of assumption challenging life for a very long time and done a lot of this work. So I was particularly interested and particularly excited to have her on as an early guest. I think in many ways her work gets to the heart of what Delightful Dissent is all about. So without too much of me going on, Margaret, I'd like to ask you if you could introduce yourself a little bit about your work and the kind of people that you work with, please.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Matthew. And just to say how much pleasure it's brought me having, the relationship that we've built up over time. Because as Matthew says, a lot of my life has been about questioning what is assumed. Just as a little bit of background, I come from a large family, all males. And so my first question was, why should I be different from them? And so that was almost how my curiosity, my lifelong curiosity started, was just because a thing is so is not limiting. it invites question, it invites exploration. And so that's, been a lot of what my life has been about. And in fact, as I left school, and was the statutory request from my father with each of us as we reached school leaving age was, well, now what are you going to do? And the assumption was that I would go to university, which I was perfectly happy to do. However, what was not well received was the fact that I wanted to do medicine, and medicine was not good for girls those years ago. Fortunately, things have changed. However, I am fascinated by the human condition, both at a physical level and at a psychological level. So my first qualification was in nutrition as a dietitian, and then I moved on from there to psychology. It seemed like a natural progression in terms of understanding what it is to be human. And having worked in both fields for quite a long time, I was then fascinated by positive psychology, a way to look at people, not from what's wrong with them, rather from what's right. And how do we take what is right with people and embrace that, embellish it, bring it into the forefront. I remember school being very, very much about what was wrong with us. Mm. And in fact, the quote that I wanted to use is along the lines of what school actually dictated to us, May I share that quote with you?
Yes, by all means. Yeah, we can go to that. Yeah.
This is a quote by a man called Warren Berger, who's a journalist, an American journalist, who has looked quite a lot at the whole thing of questions and the function of questions in life. And his quote is, "Knowing the answers will help you in school. Knowing how to question will help you in life." And so I remember the schooling being painful about you had to have the right answer. And
I think I would do really, really like that quote. I think it resonates very strongly for me. And I think, there's something, understanding your work and knowing your work fairly well now, that working with people who do ask these kind of questions and who are pushing that edge a bit and who are a bit different, a bit potentially a bit eccentric, but doing so from this place of strength and finding that strength in your uniqueness as a set of practices, and that your coaching work is kind of is focused on finding what that is and exploring that and cultivating it. And I think that's a really really positive thing, and the quote really gets to the point of why that is necessary, why we would need that, because it seems on some level like, okay, well, why would we not just play to our strengths? Why would we not just do that? And if we're a little bit outside of the norm, if we don't think like everyone else for whatever reason, it can actually be very challenging. And we're taught, and when I say taught, I use that in a sense that it's conditioned into us. I think that it's not okay to do this.
And yet, for me, what is really fascinating is that if we look at science is about actually looking, observing, and exploring to find out what lies there. And we also know that science is not static, that we're always building further on the knowledge, always growing, which is what I believe our lives are about. We're always growing. We're always evolving into something. And it's not age-related. In fact, I feel very strongly that, again, one of the assumptions about life is that once you reach a certain age, you should retire. Well, based on?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about retirement, and I think again, and it plays to the quote in some ways, is that we've got to earn the right to do what we want to do and be who we are. And we got to spend 60 years slaving away, or however long slaving away, before we can do that, before we can express ourselves. And by that point, we're so kind of tired and kind of worn down by not having done that, that there's actually very little we can do. For many people, it's often they've just moved away from that, and it's too much to move back. And I often talk to people about creating a life that you would never retire, that you wouldn't want to retire from, which is a very different proposition, I think.
Well, and it's very much been my attitude, is that my work has engaged me more and more. The more experienced I've become, the more people I've been exposed to, the more, I work with people, the more enjoyment, the more pleasure, actually, that I get from working, and to the point where it's not work. It is how I've chosen to occupy time.
Yeah, it becomes, I think for me, it's like it's work is what helps, is kind of what creates something, usually what helps other people. But the other side of that is, what do we enjoy? And the intersection of those two things is really challenging, particularly if you are different, if you aren't entirely as expected in some significant way. But creating that intersection is absolutely the most rewarding, personally, and on an experiential level, and usually materially rewarding thing that people can do.
And I think it reflects also onto others, is that if one is happily engaged with something, you're less of a burden to others. Not that we naturally become burdens, but we are contributing. We're continuing to contribute and not even reaching the point of needing to take. That is out of proportion with
where we are getting something from someone else, they are giving it, and they're benefiting from that giving in the same way that we are when we help them. And for me, that's the essence of interdependence, which is as a state to work towards. I think is a really wonderful thing. I would like to move onto our assumption, which today, because we're wandering around the thing, and I really wanted to kind of get into that, because I think it really does pertain to that. So today's assumption is that good people don't ask difficult questions, and I think there's something really interesting in that, because for me, there is something in asking a question that does something that's kind of disruptive, and sometimes it isn't helpful to disrupt. Sometimes it isn't helpful to push that edge. And equally, there are kind of like what in a difficult question, there are also kind of questions that aren't very helpful, and I think that's one of the interesting things here, is that there are better questions and, well, more helpful questions and less helpful questions. And so it's, when we say a difficult question, I think it's a really important thing to pick apart. But what I'd like to do, and first of all, is really ask you exactly what it means to you. What does this phrase mean to you? And also, where does it kind of show up for you personally, first of all?
The question which fascinated me right from the beginning was that in questioning, as the quote actually says, are we questioning to gain knowledge, to gain more information, to understand better the situation that we might find ourselves in? Or are we questioning to provoke, to prod the bear, as it were, into perhaps saying something that would not otherwise be revealed. There's so many, I think, qualitative things around questions, and it's the ethos behind it that is important. I can ask a very challenging question of somebody. If I do it aggressively, it's going to get a completely different response from the way I might phrase it when I am genuinely being curious. I really want to know. It's that curiosity and that quality that is almost childlike. It's the sort of curiosity that a child innocently will ask a question. And depending on the person who's being questioned, how safe they feel around the area, as to whether they can answer, will actually engage in an interaction and an interchange, or become defensive. All the various things that we as human beings can actually do.
That really, sorry, it does really resonate for me, that experience, particularly as a child, and my own experience. So yeah, thank you for raising it. It's I think that idea of an innocent question is a powerful one in itself. Is that you can ask a question from genuine curiosity without an angle, without without simply to know, because you feel that the exploration has value, rather than because you're trying to influence the person in a certain direction.
Yes, and I'm kind of having a quiet little giggle here, thinking about one of the earliest of my apparently very cheeky questions that I asked as a little girl, was to ask how old my father was. And I was told to hold my tongue. And I have to say, every now and again, I think back to that expression of "hold your tongue, child," which used to come up quite often, was whether I was actually genuinely supposed to do that.
Yeah.
So I'm being very disobedient because I didn't.
Yes, but then if you literally do, if you take that literally, it's you're suddenly you're being even more flippant and even worse. So
Exactly.
it's a really interesting thing to this idea of this, like, the underlying assumptions in a question, and that we should be aware of them. We're expected to be aware of the rules of the space, and that's not necessarily a very good thing to be. There are always, one of the interesting things about this work is, people often talk about assumptions and say, don't make assumptions. And for me, that denies the fact that we're always making assumptions.
Exactly.
And if we can't question those assumptions, then it's really, really difficult to move anything forward and move outside of the existing context, move things forward, which ties up very much with what you said about kind of advancing knowledge. What we can know about. We can only know about stuff we can kind of conceive and question. So we can't move forward if not.
Yes, and I Matthew, for me, what is really exciting about gaining knowledge is that it also calls into question our ability to differentiate. Here's a bit of knowledge, well, does this make sense? Does it actually sit well with my value system? Is it, something that I can take on board? Not because I want to be an authority on it, but purely to actually know more about myself. Know thyself.
I think that self-knowledge is a really interesting one as well, because what I'd like to explore is a bit more about this particular assumption and what it does. So because all knowledge kind of has an effect, and this is one of the key things of this particular assumption, actually, I think. But who benefits from the idea that you shouldn't ask difficult questions? And who benefits if we change that?
all right, the first part of it, who benefits by not being challenged, it really takes us fully into the controlling influence in life. The authority that really believes that they have the answer, there is an answer that will prevail. And of course, that's at its extreme. We take it into various doctrinal, theories and so on, and that there is an absolute way to be. And if you deviant from that, you're disobedient, or you, in some way, you are not playing the game.
I think that idea of establishing the rules of the game, and there being fixed rules of the game that we all have to follow, is a very interesting one. And one of the things I've been playing with, one of the ideas is that it's different. We assume that operating outside of the rules is the same as breaking the rules.
Yes.
And actually they're fundamentally different things. But it is actually more challenging to authority if you operate outside of the rules. Breaking the rules almost justifies the authority, justifies the reason that it's like that. Yeah. Whereas stepping outside and saying, well, no, this is the framing is different. Actually challenging the framing is a fundamentally different thing.
While we've been talking, I've been thinking about Copernicus, and his revelationary discovery that the sun, in actual fact, was the center of our universe and not the earth. And that was seen as heretical. And so the authority of the then church was being challenged by science. And I think that that's often, whether it's not obviously only church, but church, state, various other fairly rigid structures in our lives that find it very awkward to be challenged.
I think it's really interesting for me is that I suspect if we were to frame it in the times of the day, is that the church would have seen itself as scientific. The church would have seen itself as living as being the empirical authority. And there's something that's come up for me, interestingly, in my work, is the idea of scientism, and that now we have the kind of, basically it's the privileging of what we know now over what we might know. Exactly. Regardless of what framework it was arrived at, and regardless of how it was challenged. So I think, I'm really interested in. I think the scientific method versus scientifically acquired knowledge is an interesting thing there for me. And the on some level, we're not quite safe with science either in this space.
I think many people are not safe with science. But again, it's quite edgy in that it's exciting to not be sure, because you can still play in the field of possibilities when we're not sure. The minute we actually fix something, now we've got a rule, Boyle's law, or any of the other ones I remember learning in physics, that you've now got a law and that applies no matter what.
And I think this idea of play and exploration is a really important one for me, and kind of leads me to the next question about who's going to benefit from challenging things. But I just wanted to share. We've got a comment come in, so thank you, Emily, around attachment to a specific answer and needing a specific answer, and that you're not then that by separating that out, you're not kind of responsible for someone else in that way. You make yourself responsible for someone else when you take on their answer. So I really like that angle. Thank you. And
saying is,
and that agendalessness is actually almost about controlling ourselves and controlling other people, and that relationship. And I think there's something really wonderful in that. So yeah.
And it makes me think also about, being certain is quite a safe psychological place to be. If I'm certain, then I know how the story is going to unravel. Whereas if I can play in the possibles or the options or the uncertainties, it requires a certain amount of internal security to be able to do that.
I think there's also something around understanding who benefits from certainty in this for me, and who doesn't, and where our models take us down a path, because there is an element of us manifesting our models. We do kind of create within that space.
Yeah.
So if you're very tied to a model, there are people who are genuinely have a vested interest in the continuation and fear that they might lose something if we go outside of this. And I think that's something if we're led to do this, we have to engage with. We have to engage with that fear.
And I think engaging with fear, or not engaging with fear, avoiding fear, is often what causes us to not question. Is that the certainty allows us to be at peace, as it were, with at least some of the assumptions and some of the ways in which we approach life.
And that idea, I think, of being at peace with uncertainty, is really fundamentally important. And when we can be that, it opens up a different way of thinking about everything, because we have to make assumptions. We have to work within a framework. We have to do that to do things, to be effective. But when we forget that we are also working in uncertainty, that those are connected to the greater uncertainty, that there isn't that kind of we haven't had access to perfect knowledge, whether or not that's even possible.
Yeah,
that's a separate question, I think. But that if we accept that we haven't, then it means working in quite a different way.
While you're talking, Matthew, I was just thinking about one of my favorite theories that Jung had, or at least one of the things that Jung always spoke about, and that is that life is both and that, so often we're in that space of it could be this and it could be that. However, for now, let's make it this, because we can work within this framework, remembering that it could also be the opposite. And when we're safe enough, we can then explore that. So we're constantly moving between the opposites, as it were, of what is right, what is wrong, or what is a dissent.
And I think that difficult question that moves us into the opposite almost creates a paradox, I suppose, but a hidden one that you're not allowed to create. One that's feels like the really interesting work. And you're right. And I don't think you can step into that both and space without first holding that paradox. I think that's a really big thing. And so, if we're talking about challenging this work, then we are talking about stepping into this difficult space that genuinely is really, really hard for people. I don't want to belittle the work of kind of holding this space, and that there is value in the certain, in the knowledge that we have and the structured knowledge that we have, because there is huge value in it. We're moving it forward, and I think that's the difficulty is what happens when we do change that. What happens when the certainty shifts?
And while you're talking, I'm thinking about the kind of creative process that also develops out of Jung's work, and that is that we start with a thesis. We then bring in the antithesis, and that moving those two together ultimately gives us synthesis of some sort. However, that synthesis then becomes a new thesis. And so the process, which is a very creative process, is always find the opposite, bring them together in whatever way, makes sense to us. However, it then becomes a new thesis.
And that cyclic nature of the work then is a very different thing from having this kind of absolute truth, and that a difficult question that almost, I think there's an element of, when I think of as the kind of difficult questions, particularly I kind of told not to ask. Actually, I was going to say as a child, but if I think back through quite a lot of my working life as well, are those questions that are like, well, this is, that are challenging to the existing thesis, that we are working in this context, and that we're sure about that, and we need to be sure about that, and we're going to carry on doing that. And where there starts to be evidence that may not be the case, when there starts to be, and that, when I say evidence as well, I think it's important to know that we can't test things ahead of time in this space. We can't be sure. You can't go from one certainty to another certainty without going through uncertainty first. That's the challenging thing. You have to let go of the existing ground before you can find the new one. And I think for many people, and particularly many people in authority, that's a very, very difficult thing to do.
And I suspect that the reason, or one of the reasons that makes it so difficult, is that stability at some level is important in order for anything to happen. But it can't be so unstable that we never have any firm ground on which to actually base the next exploration.
And I think that again, that plays very nicely with my the ideas around complexity theory, and that life emerges at the edge of chaos. You have this balance between chaos and change, and order and fixity, and that you need both for the continuation of life, and for that growth and that thriving. I think what's interesting for me in this is my experience is there are some people who are really given to ask difficult questions, who by their nature just do it without any intention. They are people who kind of innocently almost continually ask difficult questions. And I think for some people almost ask difficult questions simply by virtue of their existence. They are almost a walking paradox. How can people who are like that engage with this difficulty, with this assumption, in a way that is positive and moves things for them, so that they can start resolving their own challenges, but also working with, what is already, and how doing that? Because I think in this space, when we realize that there's something outside of consensus reality, it's very easy to then be like, well, it's all wrong. We have to throw it all away and start again. And that the existing authorities in the space have no authority. And that leads us down a very unhelpful path of the kind of, it's not actually relativism, it's kind of equalism. It's that everything, all opinions are equal. Yeah. And I don't believe that either. Just because we can't have absolute truth doesn't mean that we can be more or less true, more or less helpful in our knowledge and our approach.
And I think, again, it's that stability and instability, moving constantly backwards and forwards in the known, unknown, questioning, not questioning, stable, unstable, is that is in actual fact what life is life is unstable, because it's always emerging in one way or another. However, we see it as stable. I am the same person that went to bed last night that got out of bed this morning. Well, probably 99% of me is the same. But, things have changed. I had a dream, which has suddenly made me realize something that I hadn't actually realized before. And so for me, the uncertainty place is the place of adventure. It's where we can choose to go or not choose to go. It really is up to us to make that responsible decision.
And so if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, yes, this kind of sounds like me, and they're interested in exploring this and pushing this a little bit further, what advice could you give them? What suggestions would you make about how they might do this, particularly perhaps if they have experienced this pushback in the past and they have experienced this? How can they approach this in a different way?
At a really practical level, one of the tools that is quite useful is to journal about it, to write. Long way back, there was some research on the power of the actual handwriting in the journaling fashion, either to release stress or to help clarify, etc. And if one can actually journal without a preconceived idea of what you want to get out of it, that it allows actually unconscious material that might be influencing or either adversely or conversely. It allows it to surface when we are not writing to say something specific, purely letting that flow of reflection, of thought, of ideas, of assumptions, all of that to just come up. It's very playful as well. One of my favorite things is Lego. Lego, you can sort of have hundreds of different pieces and you can put it together in all sorts of ways and make something stable out of it. Only to break it down. I mean, a child does that very effectively. Break it down and let's try something else.
Absolutely. And kind of build it and start again. And I think approaching it that way is really helpful, and kind of ties us back to Emily's comment as well. When we don't have an agenda in our exploration, it's much easier to then bring other people in to play, and it's like, well, I'm not pushing this to a certain point, and that it's a genuine invitation to explore. And I think being able to do that really for ourselves is a first step, is an interesting thing. So it's and as you say, and I think journaling is probably a really powerful practice in that, because we learn that a lot of this stuff actually isn't safe, and when we're inviting someone else into that space, we want to be able, we need a degree of safety, we need a degree of self-assurance.
Absolutely.
To be able to reasonably and responsibly welcome people into a space. And I think this is one of the interesting things about challenging authority, and actually brings back to the very original quote that you started with, is that we develop that in our own domains for ourselves. And when we don't have the opportunity to question, we don't have the chance to develop this capacity to be comfortable in our own exploratory space, and then to bring other people into it, because it's never been shown to us, it's never been modeled for us. And so it's actually really, it holds us back collectively, because we can't all do that work, and everyone has a degree of this unique perspective and this ability to move something forward in a way that no one else can.
Yes. And I think it is our personal responsibility. And one of the things about moving out of schooling, formal schooling, is that we begin on the basis that we've acquired knowledge, that we then begin to ask those questions, to really say, well, that's what I was taught. Does that make it so? And when we question, and I think this is also an incredibly important thing, is we don't question to deny something. It is really, for me, questioning is very much about exploration. What are the options? What are the possibilities? What is the, so it's a more expansive opening out thing than closing down and confining a thing.
Absolutely. And I think this confinement plays to something else that's another thing that we kind of share in our work, and was one of the other reasons I was so keen to talk to you on this episode, was that a lot of the message is really about conforming to others' expectations, and that's quite narrow. So it's not just it's both, yes, you need to reach a standard, but don't exceed the standard. Don't go beyond it. Don't become too strong. Don't become too powerful, particularly in this narrative changing capability. It's like, well, if we ask people to ask questions, if we teach people to ask questions, then they're going to ask difficult questions. It's like, how? And we can't, it's that belief that we can't handle that, on some level, that the system can't manage that those in charge will be threatened by difficult questions. And actually, for me, thinking about leadership and self-leadership is my biggest challenge as I ascended in organizations was actually that people stopped asking difficult questions. And all of the best leaders that I've spent time with actually solicited difficult questions. It's like, how can we create that for ourselves as well? How do we ask ourselves the difficult questions? But how do we invite other people to ask difficult questions of us, because they're reading us and they're doing that work. And I think where I was going with this is that this plays very much into strengths and understanding what the unique constellation of our capability, and allowing that other people may see things differently and be able to do things differently that we simply don't have the same capability in, even if we are leaders, maybe particularly if we are leaders, that we don't have to have all the answers.
And I think that you really touched on something important there. And again, why that quote fascinated me about schooling teaches you to have the answer. That if you do not have the answer, you're lacking. And that is the part of schooling that I really kicked against tremendously as a kid, was if I don't have the answer, please at least show me where I can find the answer. Because if you keep telling me the answer, I get bored. There's no kind of elbow room. There's no place to play. There's no place to actually be curious without being somehow punished. So the rules and regulations, I sometimes think that a lot of rules and regulations are put in place for the convenience of the people who put them in place, so they don't have to work too hard.
I think for me, convenience and fear, and the two, if I think about comfort and fear, maybe I would say comfort and fear is that they're very much two sides of the same thing in that circumstance. And and one of the other interesting things about a lot of rules is that they're very much retrospective. They're involved in what did happen, and they only account for what did happen. They don't actually ask the difficult questions. It's about what might have happened. How can we actually create more of that? And those hard rules are often maybe necessarily retrospective. We can't know for sure in the future, in this forward-looking space, and that's a difficult thing to do. Yes,
I think it is. It's easier for some people than it is for others. And this is why I think that, having obviously a basis of sound for ourselves, sound knowledge, on which we can then question, we can in fact push ourselves out on the limb, stretch ourselves, always from that place though, that we do have some security, some sort of value system that is important to us, that is where we return to.
Mm.
And so for me, it's always, life is really like a spiral going upwards. We're not sort of going over the same plane all the time. That we have a discovery. That opens up this possibility. It closes down on that possibility. Where does that take us?
And I think what's really interesting in that for me is how much of a mutual discovery it is. It's a co-created discovery. It's not something that I come to on my own as the authority, and I can't do that because I can't step outside of my own perception really in that way. Which actually does bring me very well to ask if anyone in the audience has any questions, anything that we haven't covered. I know I want to acknowledge how hard it is to ask a question when we've been talking about asking questions well for 3/4 of an hour. So please don't feel too self-conscious and go ahead and have a play, see how it goes. So if you do have any questions, please do share them in the comments now. Or in general, any comments as well, and your own perspective on this, because I'd love to hear from you. So, it is such an intricate thing, that relationship between certainty and uncertainty, and and how we figure out what's useful and continues to be useful, and how we let go of what's no longer serving, without any guarantee that there's going to be something new in the first place, and something better. And that, I think, that fear of not knowing, of chaos, is absolutely is a valid fear. We don't want to start from completely nowhere if we can possibly avoid it, because that doesn't serve us. And I think it's also really important for me to note that when we talk about chaos and uncertainty and certainty, is they don't really reflect what we're looking at. They reflect our disposition towards it. Like, do we have a model? Do we feel comfortable with that model? Is this model reliable? There's no such, that it's not really about a system being in any different state. It's just, does it work? Do we understand it?
And does it work in this context? It may work in this context and perhaps not in another. And having enough flexibility around it so that we can apply where appropriate and suspend at other times.
And
sorry, go on.
I was going to say that flexibility, I think, is really important. And one of the interesting things, again, about knowing one's strength is knowing when it makes sense to withhold a little bit of that strength, because there are certain circumstances where it isn't helpful to ask a really difficult question, where we do just need to get to an outcome. We can be in that situation, and understanding that you have this way of seeing the world and you can work in this way, and knowing when to use it and how to use it, is actually one of the really important things about not coming into conflict and creating kind of positive change.
And I think that that's, a way of explaining what we mean by wisdom, is knowing when to push, knowing when to hold back, knowing and being able to sense actually that it's perhaps too provocative to ask a question at a particular time. And that there may be another time that same question could be asked.
Or that there may be a different way that same question can be asked if necessary.
Yeah. And, I've been thinking now in this last few moments about how many of us, again, through the schooling system, are afraid of making mistakes. And a mistake, again, has that negative connotation. Something's wrong about it. And yet it can often be the very place where something new and exciting begins to emerge, because a mistake has been made.
I think of, if you think about mistakes, and what we mean by mistakes and what we mean by failure. And again, they're kind of related to prediction and our ability to figure stuff out. And it feels, if we go back to science and the kind of scientific method and falsification, we're looking for disproving things. We're kind of seeking a null hypothesis. We're seeking the idea that we're wrong. And to actively seek that, or spend some time actively seeking that and exploring where we might have gaps, where we might be incomplete, and understanding that helping others do that can be really high value work as well, and doing it for ourselves can be really high value work. Despite the message that we may have picked up, I think is a really important way of challenging this fundamental assumption. Because difficult questions, I think the ultimate difficult questions are the ones where we don't have an answer yet. They're like the ones where you fall off the edge of knowledge.
Yes. For now. But falling off the edge of knowledge occasionally is a helpful thing to do, is a fun thing to do, can be a fun thing to do. My favorite way of saying that is when you fall off the edge, make sure you packed the parachute.
Yes, indeed. And I think that's the other thing, actually, is where what is interesting for us personally to explore is a really important thing, in creating that situation and saying, well, it's okay to want to explore different things. It's okay for us to have these different domains. And it's okay for someone to say, I don't want to explore this. I don't feel safe in this space. It's not of interest to me. It's not worth what I might find out. I don't think it's for me. And that's okay too. And we part of respect for, is respecting people's sense of that. But I think, and that's also okay to say if we are an authority figure. But if we set ourselves up as an absolute authority, we can't do that. Because there can't be anything outside of that. And that becomes really, really difficult. And it doesn't put us in a good position either. I think that's the other thing, is it that really that because difficult questions move everything forward, they make more knowledge available. Ultimately, everyone is better off for challenging these things when it's the right time to do so, when we have the resources available to do so, the time and the energy. Because if we don't move anything forward, we don't benefit. Nothing changes, and eventually something will come from outside that we don't understand and have no opportunity to understand it.
Exactly. Knocks us clean off our perches.
Exactly.
Really attached to.
And the very the person who suffers most in that situation is the person who has the vested interest in the current way in the system. Is that it is precarious being in that kind of leadership authority position, and the unexpected is exactly what knocks you off your perch. So I think there's really interesting as a kind of as two outcomes then from this is, first of all, for those of us who are given to asking difficult questions, it feels like for me it's a question of understanding the domain that you work in, understanding your strength and your power, the power of these questions, and using that for your benefit and for the benefit of other people. And equally, it's where you do have authority, where you do have the answers, whatever those answers may be, it's opening yourself to contradiction and to paradox and exploring the edges of that knowledge and the edges of that, and inviting that and being welcoming for that, and creating a situation where those people who do ask you difficult questions can ask those questions.
Yes. I think that again, we keep cycling back to a favorite expression of mine, and that is being able to play with the elements, because we play until such time as something has formed that makes sense in the moment, or makes sense in the time period, or whatever it is that external restrictions are imposing. That always with this knowledge that things are temporary. They do not become fixed for all time. It fascinates me, for example, when I heard for the first time that the universe is expanding all the time. It seems so enormous, and yes, it's expanding. What does that mean? If I try to hold that concept in my mind, that all these planets and universes are constantly moving away from each other, I get to the point of not being able to comprehend it. It's almost too much. Yet I can understand it at a verbal level, that something's expanding, it's always getting bigger. But when I try to get into that space of the universe, it kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, it's applying an idea to something new, and applying an existing metaphor, an existing idea, a set of ideas to something new. And I think, understanding that is to some degree the kind of work that we're looking at and we're exploring and helping others do is a really interesting way to look at it. And I think is a really helpful kind of summation of this, that if we apply something, our difficult questions really join two concepts that haven't been joined before, or seek to do that, then we're doing something really exciting.
Well, it's the novel, isn't it? It's a novel expression of an old, perhaps, idea.
Absolutely. And that's definitely. And it's the repeating cycle, and the coming the end of one cycle and the beginning of the next, which does take me to wrapping up. So we're coming to the end of the hour, and we are coming to the end of this cycle. And I think one of the really exciting things about doing this is how we are. It does feel like this is happening through these Delightful Dissent episodes. We're having a whole load of conversations that are kind of about different assumptions, but they are actually looking at similar things, and we do keep having these repeated themes but with different angles on. So I think it's really really exciting for me personally that this is happening, and I'm so grateful to you, Margaret, and to my other guests for being part of it. This is, we've explored a lot and we've covered a lot of ground. So if you do have follow-up questions, then please do leave a comment or get in touch with either of us. And if you would like to get in touch with Margaret, then probably the best way to do that is to send a connection request on LinkedIn with your with a question. So and she can get back to you there. We'll share the link to Margaret's profile in the show notes, so you can follow that directly. Also, actually, if you are watching on LinkedIn, you can see her as a speaker already, so you can just click on that and ask a question. Equally, though, engage with us, but engage with other people as well. Ask questions, share how you feel about this, question this, share your questions about this with someone else. This doesn't have to be certain. Do please, if you found it useful, share it with someone, because that's how this grows, and how we all do this work together, and how this community grows and creates the kind of change that we all want to see on some level. The next episode will be same time next week, actually, Wednesday, the 9th of December at 1 p.m. UK time. And I'll be talking to Sarah Osterholzer on the assumption that it's unprofessional to be your full self at work. And as I said, I think this dovetails very nicely. Again, entirely unplanned and unintentional, but this is kind of how it works. And I think there's some really interesting overlaps. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much, Margaret, for coming on the show today. I've really enjoyed this. So yeah, thank you.
And thank you for inviting me. I've had such fun. And for me, it's also exciting to see how we didn't plan it to such an extent that we couldn't have all sorts of, new ideas pop in.
Absolutely. I'll thank you. A couple of comments equally of thanks. So yes, thank you very much for watching as well. I really do appreciate everyone who watches, those who watch live and share comments, and everyone who watches afterwards as well. It's great to have you as an audience, and please do do have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.
Happy questioning.